Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the provincial government will audit Ontario's children's aid societies. Critics say it's a smokescreen to cover up declining funding.
An update on Ontario Place, the lease, the demolition, and the cost of cancellation.
Toronto Nobel laureate Geoffrey Hinton has words for Doug Ford over the closure of the Ontario Science Centre.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to talk about what rotting animal carcasses have to do with city policy.
Can't wait for that one. And I'm going to look into whether this is the moment for the NDP and its leader, Marit Stiles.
It's Friday, October 11th, 2024, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner.
Oh, sir.
Always like to start the podcast by you giving me a little bit of sugar here, just sort of...
A little more for good luck there.
Yeah, connects us a little bit. Yeah, that's terrific. Happy Thanksgiving, incidentally.
Yes, happy Thanksgiving.
Got some plans?
Nothing major. It was Sunday dinner with family, and but otherwise going to try and take it easy.
Very nice, very nice.
Yourself?
My T-shirt is kind of giving away what I'm going to be doing this weekend. Yeah, there's the wide shot right there. Yeah, where are we going? Little Current, South Bay, Mindamoya, Kagawang. Yeah, Manitoulin Island. Going to have a good time. We got some feedback to last week's program.
Yes, we did. Folks may remember that last week we were talking about the number of MPPs who are opting not to run again, and in particular NDP members who are going to try and give federal politics a shot. Mm-hmm. And we mentioned that Ottawa Centre MPP Joel Harden might be considering making the move, because one big difference between representing Ottawa Centre as an MP versus an MPP is that you don't have to spend as much time in your life commuting down the 401.
Well, that is true.
Yes.
Yes.
That is just factual.
Yes, correct.
Now, Steve, would you believe me if I told you that Mr. Harden listens to our little podcast here?
Well, I never thought he did, but I guess maybe he does.
He is not just a listener, but if I may say an avid one, because bright and early Friday morning, he reached out to me to very politely say that he felt that it was a bit unfair and he wanted to chat.
What was unfair?
Well, he wanted to say that it's not just because of the commute that he is
obviously.
looking.
No.
Yes.
I certainly did not mean to convey that that's the reason he wants to seek a federal seat.
No. And he did acknowledge that it has been difficult on his family, particularly when the House is in session and he does have to spend so much time in Toronto. But when an MPP asks to speak, I'm always happy to have a phone call.
Sure, we listen.
And so, we had a bit of a chat, and he said something that was interesting that I wanted to share with our listeners, because I think our listeners and viewers might find it interesting. One of the arguments he is making for why he can do good work at the federal level is that he's told me that over the last 6 years at Queen's Park, he believes he's learned to work across the aisle with conservatives, as it has been a conservative government for his entire time at Queen's Park. And I would say that raised an eyebrow with me. I was a bit skeptical, because I don't think the last 6 years have been spectacularly collegial.
They will not go down in history the last 6 years for being reach across the aisle collegial.
Yeah,
I think that's fair to say.
I think that's fair to say too. And yet he did cite some examples of important work that he believes he's managed to achieve with conservatives, nevertheless being in power all this time. One of the specific examples he talked about was working with the government to make sure that families of people who are in long-term care homes don't face retaliations from the long-term care home operators when they advocate for their loved ones, right? There was a few incidents where long-term care homes were slapping people with trespass notices because they were basically advocating forcefully for their loved ones in care. And Harden worked with the government to change some of the policies around that. So that was one of those examples that he cited. And again, I raise this to say, I think a theme you and I have returned to a few times in this podcast is that question period is important. The big laws that get debated, those are important. But there's also lots of important work that happens at the provincial level that doesn't ever make the cameras. It doesn't ever make the spotlight. A lot of this stuff happens with literally an MPP walking across the floor from the opposition benches to the front benches just to grab 2 minutes with a minister and say, hey, there's this thing going on in my riding and I think you need to know about it. This is a real problem. Let's see if we can work together. Yeah. And a lot of that work happens away from the public eye informally, but it is nevertheless very important. Joel Harden is by no means the only MPP who can talk about a record of those kinds of accomplishments. I'm sure lots, if not all MPPs could talk about similar examples. And I don't think I would be editorializing too much if I said that we don't see as much of that federally right now. If anything, the partisan breakdown in relations is even more severe there.
It's a little sticky up there these days.
Yeah, and so maybe bringing some of that to the House of Commons might be worthwhile.
Well, they say in baseball you can't tell the players without a program. So I think the program at the moment, if Joel Harden runs federally in the next federal election, he will be running against, if in fact the current member for Ottawa Centre runs, that would be Liberal Yasser Naqvi. So we're going to have two former MPPs facing off against each other in the next federal campaign, probably.
Yes, unless a provincial election derails those plans.
I hear they may go early.
Yeah,
Is that possible?
That might come up.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Harden, we put those comments on the record. Very good. And with that, we're off to issue 1. The provincial government has announced it will be launching a review of Ontario's children's aid societies. This after Doug Ford accused agencies of working in, quote, Taj Mahals, with managers giving themselves exorbitant bonuses. JMM, they had a technical briefing about this. I guess earlier this week you were there. What can you tell us?
So just to give a bit of background to our viewers, the Children's Aid Societies, they intervene, they do lots of work, but in particular they intervene in cases where a child might be at risk and needs protection from its current situation at home, and they're responsible for placing children into longer-term care with, for example, foster parents. Societies are not strictly government bodies, but their role is defined by law, and they get their funding from the government in terms of grants. So the government has an interest in making sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent on the stuff that it is supposed to be spent on, quite aside from, obviously, the government wanting to make sure that children are being well cared for.
Now, to the best of my knowledge, provincial governments tend not to ask for audits unless they think money is being poorly spent. Is that the case here?
Certainly, the government is making the case that, at least that they have grounds for suspicion. They have made some allegations of cases where children's aid societies seem to be spending money that was supposed to be dedicated towards children's care and is instead being spent outside of that scope. And this is a very common arrangement when the government hands over money to any body, whether that is a school board or a children's aid society or a public broadcaster. There are intended targets that this money should be used for this, but not this. This money should be used to protect children, but it shouldn't be going towards your property maintenance, that kind of thing. Right. And so part of the allegation is that at least in some cases, children's aid societies are spending money where they're not supposed to. Other allegations are that they are spending more than they should be, that they're running deficits that the government is functionally on the hook for. We should say that this isn't exactly a judicial case, but I feel like we should almost say that nothing has been proven in court.
Right. These allegations have not been tested in court.
Yes.
That's
the audit is beginning. The audit has not concluded. We don't have real findings of fact yet. And on the side of the children's aid societies, that there are people who say that this is a distraction, right? I believe the union representing some of the workers at these societies has functionally said that this is a smokescreen designed to deflect attention from what they say is declining funding from the province.
Well, that should be pretty easy to find out if it's in fact true. So is the provincial government spending less on children's aid societies than they once did?
Well, you would think that would be an easy answer. But this is kind of a familiar story. We've seen this basic dispute a lot, certainly in the last 6 years. In terms of raw dollars spent transferred to CASs in 2024, that sum is larger today than it has ever been before. So in that basic sense, no, there has been no decline in spending. I think it is at least fair to argue that number has not kept up with inflation. It's by the government's statement, it is about $1.7 billion. It would probably be a few hundred million higher if it had just been adjusted for inflation over a decade. So fair to say, perhaps, that the money that is on offer doesn't buy as much as it used to. But there's even more. This is one of those cases where it's even more complicated than that, because the number of cases that societies intervene in has declined by about 30% over the last decade. Again, that's from the government. So even with inflation, there is an argument that the province is still spending more per actual child than it did a decade ago.
You weren't kidding when you said follow the math on this is a hard one.
Right. And just because
There's more?
it's never over,
Yeah.
the Financial Accountability Office, again, this is the independent office of the legislature that looks at these kinds of things, has estimated that the ministry with overall responsibility for this file, that's the Ministry of Children, Community, and Social Services, they are spending $3.7 billion less overall than that ministry needs to meet its stated legislated obligations. Now, that is not only the Children's Aid Societies, but it's that some would certainly include them as well.
Let me get really stark here for a second, because it is possible when you talk about audits and budgets and numbers, it's possible to get lost in the weeds of all that.
Yes.
And we need to remember at the end of the day that not every child in the province of Ontario is lucky enough to be living with a loving family and well cared for. There are far too many children who are living in precarious circumstances, and it gets worse than that. And that's why we need to pay attention to this issue.
Yes.
We did a show on this on the agenda a few weeks ago, and we discovered every 3 days, a child dies while being associated in some way with Ontario's care system. That is 354 children who have died between the years 2020 and 2022. That's shocking that happens in this province in the 21st century.
Yes, and that is absolutely one part of this audit that the government is going to be looking at. It is not exclusively looking at financial affairs. There are questions about oversight and accountability for children's aid societies. There's a case that the Toronto Star has covered extensively recently about a young girl named Nevaeh, I believe, who...
Awful story. Awful.
Yeah, just an awful story. Tragically ended up dead.
Found in a dumpster.
Yes. There are other cases of children who were placed with foster parents who they were killed. The parents have been charged but not convicted yet with murder. Really awful stuff. I mean, this ministry is one of those ministries that, again, pulling out, not just speaking exclusively about children's aid societies, but this ministry handles so many tough files. I mean, this is also the ministry that handles things like funding for children with autism. This ministry handles
welfare recipients, disability support payments.
So many tough
social
files.
services. Yep.
And these are the files that you never hear about until something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
There is presumably, and I don't know what it will take, maybe you've got something on this, there is presumably a way to fix what's wrong here. What's the big fix look like?
Well, the audit and a revamp of how the childcare system works seems at this point like it could very well help, and it doesn't seem like it could hurt more than what the status quo already is. I think there is probably a plausible argument that some of this is going to involve more money. It may involve the government taking a more direct role in the provision of these services. Ontario has a lot of cases, and children's aid societies are just one where the government sort of farms out this job to agencies that are not quite inside of the government this way. I don't know fundamentally what the final fix will be, but it is not just the government looking at this question right now. Years ago, the Tories eliminated the dedicated legislative officer, the children's advocate, folded that responsibility in with the Ombudsman's office. The Ombudsman has written reports about children's aid societies, is in the midst of doing a new investigation about some of the policies of children.
But everybody will tell you that children were better cared for when they had their own special advocate, standalone, not part of the Ombudsman's office, but standalone. Erwin Ellman was the last guy to have the job.
Yes.
Did a very good job at it. And anyway, that is not the case today.
Yes. No. And I think, without meaning to disparage the ombudsman, it's just a totally different thing when you go from having a single dedicated officer with a single mission to an officer who, however good his intentions, this is just one of many roles that he now has. But it doesn't end there. It never does end. The province is also currently in the midst of a class action lawsuit with Crown wards and other children who have been in care. There are any number of ways that we will see a lot more scrutiny put on this file over the coming months and perhaps years.
There is an old expression that we judge societies by how well they treat their most vulnerable members. And I don't know if there are too many more vulnerable members than children who don't have parents, don't have a place to sleep, need help. So by that yardstick, we got some work to do here.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, and with that, we're off to issue 2. Now, you may remember we previewed last week that there was news about Ontario Place and that the news consisted of the details of the province's lease with Therme, the European spa company, which intends to build a large tourism complex on Toronto's waterfront. So, now that we know the details, you want to take us through them?
Sure. So we knew that it was a very long-term lease. We knew that the lease term was about 95 years. What the government has released there last week is that some of the financial details that they expect over the term of the 95-year lease to collect about $2 billion in rent and maintenance. That doesn't cover all of the money that the public will receive from Therme, that the spa operator will also be responsible, for example, for paying property taxes to the City of Toronto. The Crown, the province will not be on the hook for that. In exchange, the government has committed to build a very substantial parking facility. The contract requires them to build at least 1,600 or perhaps 1,800 spaces. The government is going to build 2,500. So.
Do they know if it's going to be an underground garage or, underwater garage yet or above the ground garage? Do they know yet?
That has not been settled, according to the technical briefing that we were in last week. That's a different technical briefing. The province is still in discussion with the City of Toronto. If you're not super familiar with the geography of Toronto, Ontario Place is relatively close to Exhibition Place, where there is quite a lot of land currently devoted to parking spaces. And so one of the ideas here, instead of building a parking structure, that if it were below ground, it would also be below the water line, which you can do as an engineering matter. It's just very expensive. Instead of doing that, they could work out an agreement with the City of Toronto to use some of the Exhibition Place for parking.
What about parkland?
So the Therme has been committed to create 16 acres of new publicly accessible parkland. Therme has committed that will be publicly available. The lease says that will be public. The financial costs of that are estimated to be about $200 million. I can't help but note, and I noted this when I wrote about it for TVO.org, that is still substantially less than the hypothetical cost of that structured parking space we're talking about. Mm-hmm. I feel like maybe we should be more generous with parkland than parking spaces.
You do you?
Yeah, call me the Lorax.
Now, what about, you've put all on the record so far, all the stuff that is fairly understood.
Yes.
The most controversial part of this we haven't got to yet, which is there are penalties in this agreement if the province fails to do some of the things it is contractually obligated to do. And this is where it could get plenty expensive for taxpayers. Right.
So, again, we mentioned the plausibility of an election in the next year. And the opposition parties have all said that they would do whatever they can to cancel this lease. They've opposed this plan for Ontario Place from the beginning. But what we're talking about here is breaking the lease for convenience, right? There's not, or at least there will not be an allegation that Therme has failed to keep up their end of the bargain. This is the province walking away from the table. The conditions in the lease for breaking the lease for convenience, they have to find Therme another site in Ontario for a similar spa, as well as they have to pay the cost of the construction of the new facility, and they have to pay financial penalties. And this is just one of those wrinkles that caught my eye, and I don't think it's unheard of in these kinds of contracts, but it nevertheless caught my eye. The province then has to demolish the spa and cannot reuse that facility as, certainly it is forbidden from reusing it as any kind of entertainment venue or,
no casinos.
The government went out of their way to say that they are not planning any kind of casino at Ontario Place because they have faced allegations throughout this process that to paraphrase what I hear on Twitter all the time is like, oh, well, Doug Ford just wants to put a casino at Ontario Place. The government says, no, Therme will be forbidden from doing a casino.
Can I just understand that if the thing goes to hell in a handcart and the province has to provide another piece of land somewhere else for Therme to do its thing, There's nothing in the contract saying it would be on Manitoulin Island, is there? I just want to get that on the record right now. Because I don't think that would work. For whatever reason, I don't think that would work.
I mean, negotiating with the Indigenous people on Manitoulin would be complicated to start with.
I think you have a point there. I think you have a point there. Isn't there another provision in this thing that if they don't get the parking spots up by a certain date, the province has to pay $5 a parking spot per date?
Yes.
Ad infinitum?
Yes.
This could get expensive.
Yes. There's a whole bunch of obligations on the part of the government. Therme has a lot more freedom in this lease. While Ontario has to, once the spa is in operation, Ontario has to give 10 years notice. Pardon me. Once the spa has been in operation for 10 years, they need to give Therme 5 years notice. And meanwhile, Therme has a lot more ability to basically, they would have to pay, I believe, a few years worth of rent, but it's not like they have to build a new spa somewhere if they want to walk away from the process. So a bit of a one-sided lease. And I think the argument here, certainly I think that we will hear from opposition parties, is that all of these conditions that we're talking about really tie the hand of future governments, right?
That's the idea, though.
Yeah, and it is. It will make it potentially very, very costly for any future government, regardless of election results, to walk away from this facility. We know that Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie and Mike Schreiner have all said that they oppose this, that they would like to find some way out of it. The potential price tag for getting rid of this is certainly tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
And I repeat, that's the point. This is a legacy project for Doug Ford, and he does very much want to tie the hands of future governments if they have any ideas about canceling this thing, because, as we have heard him say, he wants this done.
Yes.
So there we go. And with that, we're off to issue 3. The province of Ontario has a new Nobel laureate in physics. His name is Geoffrey Hinton. He is the so-called godfather of artificial intelligence. He had a virtual news conference this week, and he surprised everyone with one particular answer to one reporter's question. Let's have a listen.
How would you use a neural network right now to improve Toronto as a city?
I'm not quite sure how a neural network could get rid of Doug Ford.
Now, that was not necessarily the answer anybody was expecting to hear. No. But, when you win a Nobel Prize, I guess you can say pretty much whatever you want to say. And that wasn't the only thing he had to say about the Ontario government.
No. Earlier this week, in an interview with CBC, he was asked about provincial affairs, and Hinton told the CBC that Ontarians shouldn't, quote, elect someone who's going to destroy the science centre. And
meaning what?
Well, this is where the two issues come together. I mean, so Hinton, very clearly a scientist and academic, believes passionately that young people should follow their curiosity, believes in the power of education, as, so do we at TVO.
Do we, yes.
And really believed that the science centre stood for those things, for education, for teaching children to be passionate about science and learning. In June, Hinton was one of many people who pledged money to help fix the roof of the building of the Science Centre. He personally pledged $1 million. The government, of course, has not taken up any of the wealthy benefactors on their offer. There are no plans yet to reverse course on the closure of the Science Centre and the moving of the Science Centre eventually to Ontario Place. Since we have last talked about the fate of the Science Centre, most, if not all, of the exhibits have been moved from the building. If people do not recall, this was the sudden closure of the Science Centre earlier this year, allegedly because the concrete panels in the ceiling were found to be structurally deficient.
I can tell you, we clearly have free speech rights in the province of Ontario, and Geoffrey Hinton is certainly welcome. He is indeed exercising his free speech rights. I can also tell you that there will be people in the post-secondary world who were really hoping to get grants out of the government of Ontario for the purposes of scientific research, basic research, etc., who think that those comments may make that task more difficult now. This is not a premier that likes to be embarrassed like that in public.
No, and Hinton, obviously literally a world-class scientist. There are, I guess I would say, federal funding, I think, as I understand it, for this kind of research is still the bigger bucket.
Yes.
The province has actually increased its funding for this kind of research in recent years, but I think they're still a relatively smaller player. But yeah, I can imagine some of Hinton's colleagues, perhaps some of his younger colleagues who are not yet Nobel laureates, kind of winced when they saw that.
And you can imagine people in the bureaucracy or in the Premier's office at Queen's Park saying, "He said what?" Anyways, to be continued.
Yes.
And with that, we're off to your column, my column. Okay, everybody, you know this feature. We call it Your Column, My Column. JMM and I like to reminisce about the columns that we wrote for TVO.org. That's our website over the past week. Stardust Officer, which one of your pearls of wisdom do you want to focus on today?
Bit of an animal theme. I was talking about mammoths. Was that last week or 2 weeks
Woolly
ago?
mammoths, that's
Woolly
right.
mammoths. This week I'm going to talk about raccoons and specifically dead raccoons. Over the summer, a raccoon was hit by a car on my street in East Toronto, and unlike previous occasions, this one was just never collected by the City of Toronto. And so I walked my kid to summer camp and basically, they got a lesson in the decomposition of animal bodies all summer.
It had been sitting there for a while?
Yeah, it gets pretty gross in like July, August heat.
Right.
And I didn't mention it at the time. I never wrote about it at the time because this is like one incident, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. And then it turns out that this is not, in fact, an isolated incident. The City of Toronto made a choice to reduce the standards that it sets for collecting animal carcasses, and as a cost-saving and a sort of a rationalizing measure. And I wrote about this for TVO.org because, I am somebody who, I like to think I take municipal government very seriously. I have argued on our website and elsewhere that we do need to give cities more resources to face the tough jobs that we give them in the 21st century. And yet, as somebody who does believe all of those things, it is very difficult to argue that the City of Toronto should get lots of more money and responsibility when, like, the basics kind of fall off, and like collecting dead animal carcasses, and like also like the public health problems of dead animals in general, but like dead raccoons like spread some really nasty diseases. Yeah.
Not a fun job though. Picking up dead carcasses, not a fun job.
No, and but also a reason why we leave it to professionals.
Indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
So. Anyway, all that to say that that's what I wrote about, and I continue to believe that cities get kind of a raw deal in the constitutional structure of Canadian government, and yet also I still want them to get the basics right. How about yourself?
Well, we spent a lot of time here focusing on the government, understandably so, but I thought this week we might just take a pause in that, and I wrote a column about the official opposition. That is the New Democrats. Marit Stiles is the leader. She gave a speech at the Empire Club a couple of weeks ago. And the Empire Club decided to mix it up a bit. Instead of having her come out there and give a 40-minute speech and go through, here's what we want to do on this, here's what we want to do on that, she gave a very brief 10-minute speech. And then they invited me to come up on stage and do a Q&A with her afterwards for about a half an hour and moderate a Q&A session with the audience as well. And we did that. And so, naturally, I wrote the questions. I didn't show them to anybody in the NDP ahead of time. And we did I guess we basically did an episode. Well, she's going to be here soon, isn't she?
Yeah, we're going to have her and Mike Schreiner in coming weeks.
Yeah,
so.
They're coming in a few. Anyway, so we did that. And we touched on a bunch of things, what you do on the economy, what you do on the Science Centre, what you do with Ontario Place, and so on. And then me being me, I couldn't help myself, at one point. And in fact, I'll do this with you right now. We've had 43 elections in the province of Ontario since Confederation in 1867. 43 elections. How many of those elections have a party not named Liberal or Conservative won?
Well, I've read your column, so...
Oh, okay. So, yes, I do tend to give it away in the column.
But so it's just one, right?
It's two.
Oh,
yeah,
two.
It's two. 41 of 43 elections have been won by Liberals or Conservatives. Bob Rae, obviously, 1990, the NDP won, and then in 1919, the United Farmers of Ontario won.
I always forget about the United Farmers.
Well, you're not the only one. Although they're very popular online if you look up their acronym.
Yeah.
Anyways, I asked Marit Stiles about this. I said, look, you are well aware of the math. Yeah. 41 out of 43 times. Your party is simply not an option top of mind for too many people? And her answer to that question was in the column. So you can read about it on the column. They are feeling pretty bullish right now, I have to say, because they've won second place twice in a row, 2018 and 2022 elections. That's never happened before in Ontario history. They are setting fundraising records as well. Yes, they have a few of their candidates deciding to run federally, but most of their candidates are coming back, and they'll no doubt find some other good ones to stand in ridings that they don't now hold. And Marge Stiles, I got to say, I hear this all the time from lots of people, including Liberals. She's got game.
Yep.
She's intelligent. She presents well. She knows issues well. She has school board experience. She had experience as an MPP, now as a party leader. She may be one to watch in this election campaign, whenever it is.
Well, and you mentioned the money. They are spending some of that money in a pretty big ad buy. And like, I don't watch a lot of TV, and yet even I have noticed like the NDP ads. I mean, I'm seeing them on YouTube. I'm hearing them in podcasts that I download. So not necessarily a conventional like TV and radio ad buy, but they are spending some of that money.
Okay, so those are our two columns, and we invite you to go to tvo.org, look for our pictures, click on those pictures, and you can read those columns. Now, if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing them. You can send them to onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got this week?
We have a question from Marty Johnson in Ottawa. He writes, "Hi, OnPoli podcast. The Municipal Property Assessment Corporation has paused updating property assessments during COVID and has not restarted them per provincial government orders. Given how insane property values have become, will this become a political issue for the next election? I assume restarting property value assessments would lead to properties being taxed at a higher value. Love the show. Marty Johnson in Ottawa."
Well, okay, Marty, you've actually put your finger on why the pause is in place and why this is always, like market value reassessment on property taxes is always an issue that is fraught with peril.
Yeah.
Other governments in the past have always wanted to have the value of properties better reflected in the assessments that impact charges. But it's a political loser. Every time you visit this, it's a political loser. I don't think that there's any date to restart the assessment process so that they can update the value of the property tax base. So where are we on this?
Well, so as Marty mentioned in his question, the government was, I think they were like right in the middle of the process of starting the most recent cycle of reassessments when COVID hit. And because of the chaos of the pandemic, they just said, okay, we're going to not do these reassessments. And what that meant was that basically every property in Ontario is currently being assessed at the 2016 numbers. I don't know if you paid a lot of attention to housing prices in the last 6 years, 7 years.
I'm aware. Yeah.
But they've gotten a lot more expensive since 2016, and yet those values are not reflected in MPAC rules. So the problem now, of course, is like having paused it, restarting it is going to create winners and losers. And the government, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this will not be an issue in the next election because the government is not going to come anywhere near restarting assessments.
Correct.
Until after the election.
And now, look, the unfairness of this is if you're buying a new home in a new housing survey, you are going to pay 2024 assessment rates.
Yes.
If you live, and I'm sorry, folks, don't get mad at me, it's just a fact. If you live in the old city of Toronto, for example, in a home where the reassessment has not taken place, you are maybe paying market value property taxes on values that are 10, 20, 30 years out of date. So your taxes are being artificially depressed and disproportionately paid by people who are buying newer homes. Now, you may like that if you live in an old home in the city of Toronto, but you got to admit, it's not really all that fair.
Yeah, and like municipalities are sort of, well, they're caught in a few different ways because, of course, they actually don't control MPAC. And I mean, when I used to cover Toronto City Council, I mean, the MPAC reassessment cycle always created a nightmare for councillors because people would call up screaming like, what do you mean my house's value is going up? Is this going to affect my taxes? And there's some wrinkles in the way the assessment system works, and that just because your MPAC assessment goes up, you don't necessarily get a higher tax hit. It's
Depends on the mill rate that the city charges.
Yes, it's complicated and kind of out of scope of this question. But now they're in a situation where they're I'm not even sure that they necessarily want the process to restart, but they want to know what is happening.
Yeah.
Right. And we heard this at AMO when we were there in the summer with, counselors saying, like, pick a lane, but you got to tell us what is happening next. And so, as I say, I very strongly suspect that the government will not resume the reassessment cycle until after any election that might be scheduled next year.
It does bring up a familiar refrain, though, that you hear from municipal politicians, which is whenever the premier or the finance minister go around Ontario and say, we have never raised a tax, we've been in power 6.5 years and have never, ever, ever raised a tax, municipal politicians say, yeah, that's right, because you download all those extra costs on us, and then you don't let us, you're forcing us to raise our taxes in order to pay for the stuff that either you don't pay for anymore or that we have to pay for now. So it's true with a big caveat.
With big asterisk there.
There you go.
Yes.
There you go. You want to give the email address one more time?
Absolutely. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the OnPoli podcast for this October 11th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks to our wonderful studio crew for making the podcast look so good. And our shout out this week goes to the guy taking my picture behind camera 3 there, Greg Laws. He sometimes, hey, do you guys, Sheldon, are you allowed to take a shot of Greg? When I give a shout out to somebody, shouldn't you be getting a cutaway of them so our audience can see them? There we go. Tina's on the case. There's Greg Laws back there. Greg is not full-time here, but he's been here many times. He and I go way back, probably 30 years working at this joint. And Greg has shot NBA games in the past. He's a master of many different kinds of camera work. And I always love it when he comes in here because he always gives me a hug when he sees me. And I love that. Greg, thanks for keeping me in focus this week. So until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.